Hi everyone, thank you for coming. Welcome to the Australian Aged Care Quality Agency and our seminar, which today is the Spotlight on Serious Risk and Infection Control. My name is Anne Wunsch. I'm the Executive Director of Operations, and my role in the Quality Agency is to manage the visit program for residential aged care and home care and NATSI flex services across Australia. So I look after the state offices, and this is our both our national office here on level 9 and our New South Wales office on level 7. So welcome and thank you for coming. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we meet, the land of the Darug people at Parramatta, and if you get a chance afterwards or even during your break to walk downstairs and across the road to a beautiful place down on the river, you'll see the symbol of this area, which is the eel, which is has been painted into the walkway around the river. And of course, that's the other thing about this place. This is the place of the Parramatta eels, and I guess the eels have a significance in Parramatta because they were the significant food source for the people who lived here. So the seminar today is looking at two issues, the first being serious risk and the second is infection control, and we're planning to wrap up sometime between about 11:40 and 12. So we're going to ask you to turn to your neighbours and introduce yourselves in a couple of minutes, because you're going to be hanging out together for a while, so you may as well get to know who you're with. But before we get to that, I'll also introduce Leah Asensio, and Leah's working alongside me today. We also have Kate Losey down the back of the room, and Kate's also available to help you. So timing. So why are we talking about this now? A couple of things. One is that in 2015 we reviewed our policies and our practice in relation to serious risk, and sought advice from the Australian Government solicitors, and the advice we received prompted us to consider the appropriate application of section 2.63 of the Quality Agency Principles. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. What is the appropriate application of the Quality Agency Principles under that section, and how do we come to make a serious risk decision, and what does that mean? We've had an article published in the Quality Standard. We also have provided you with a fact sheet, I believe, and you'll also receive a bulletin, and you'll also receive a copy of the slides afterwards. And today's really an opportunity to understand the practical application of this section. So we will be doing an activity, and I want you to use the opportunity to ask us questions of whatever. So we're here for that purpose. So that's the first part of the session. The second part of the session will be in relation to infection control. Now, most of you by now will have received an assessment contact online survey which seeks to clarify for us your infection control management practices. Now, we chose to do it through an online survey because it was a quick turnaround way to get some data, to get some understanding of what that looks like across the sector. We have had a pretty significant flu season this year. It's been that significant that you would have seen media reports in relation to deaths of both young and old people. And even this morning as I drove in, the Chief Medical Officer in the Commonwealth Department of Health was being quoted on ABC radio in relation to vaccination for elderly care recipients that live in residential aged care. So we're coming to the end of that season, but it's a point in time where we're seeking to understand information that would better inform all of our work for next year, for the flu season next year. So we're also happy to take any questions on that process and what we're doing with that information if you have questions on that a bit later. So serious risk, we will, as I mentioned, we have rewritten our policy to better reflect the regulatory intent. That's really what we needed to understand. What was the regulatory intent of serious risk? And that's what we want to cover today. The session will give you a brief update on our serious risk policy and highlight the key components of that policy. The fact sheet has been developed to highlight the key components of the policy, and you should have got that in your confirmation email. So I want you to just briefly consider the learning objectives on the slide and note any specific wants that may not be included there today. But Leah's happy to write up any questions or issues on a whiteboard, and we can certainly take things on notice if we need to. And as I said, I'm happy to take questions if you have any. So, the legislative requirement, is it on the next slide? Sorry. Yep, okay, that's a bit better. All right, so this is really the nub of what we need to get to today, and that is what was intended under the quality agency principles in relation to serious risk. And this is primarily sections 2.63, but 3.18 I believe apply to the home care services. So it's the same decision point, but in two different care contexts. One is residential care and the other is home care. And the issue is that that if the CEO of the quality agency, and that means CEO or delegate, and it's usually the delegate decision maker that is making a decision in relation to an assessment contact, a review audit, a reaccreditation audit, a quality review, if that the CEO or delegate identifies a failure by an approved provider of a service to meet one or more expected outcomes of the applicable standards, so where a single outcome is deemed, it has been decided it does not meet the standards, the CEO, and the next word is a critical word in our learning on this issue, it's must decide. So it's not a discretionary point in a decision framework. It's a requirement that the CEO determines whether that failure has placed, and notice with has means something that's already happened, or may place the safety, health or well-being of a care recipient of the service at serious risk. So there's a few significant issues here that we need to really sort of unpack. The first is that it could involve one expected outcome, and it could be an assessment contact, a review audit, a reaccreditation audit, a quality review. And the other is that it could apply to something that has already happened, and as well as something that is happening now or something that may happen. So has or may covers past, present and future. Now at any point, if you have a question, you can just put your hand up and ask now. You don't have to wait till a later stage. So if we go to how we got to the definition of serious risk is adopted by us using the ordinary meaning of the words when used individually and when used together. And that's because the legislation does not define serious risk. So and where that occurs in legislation, you seek to use the ordinary meaning or the dictionary meaning of the words. So serious means important or significant, and risk is exposure to danger, injury or loss. So it describes a situation that has caused harm or has the potential to cause harm to the safety, health or well-being of care recipients. And when this situation is present or is noted through that decision, sorry, I'll go back. Where the failure is noted the quality agency must act as reasonably practicable to consider the impact of that failure. So where we find a failure in the expected outcome, we need to understand whether that failure has placed or may place care recipients at serious risk. Now, this decision can be made at any time the quality agency finds there's failure to meet an expected outcome of the applicable standards. And once the finding has been made, the quality agency, as I said, must consider the evidence as to whether the failure has placed or may place. So procedurally what happens here is that the evidence that was gathered at the assessment contact, at the review audit, at the reaccreditation audit, at the quality review, that evidence is the same evidence that is tested again for the purposes of determining whether there is serious risk. So it's the same evidence that was used to understand whether the service has failed to meet an expected outcome. The finding may also relate to care recipients that are no longer receiving care. And that is because those folk may be deceased, or they may have been moved home, or they may have transferred to another facility. When we make a decision in relation to serious risk, we're making that decision in relation to an identified individual. So we're seeking information about that individual's care through the same process we are using in coming to the finding of failure. It's the same information. So it's from documentation review, it's from interviews with staff and management, it's from observation of care practices, it's from sometimes interviews also with the care recipient themselves. And sorry, I use resident and care recipient interchangeably, and that's I'm on that journey too, along with a lot of us, I guess. We also would seek to understand the views of family and friends and people that are involved in the care or the support of that individual as well. So I'll give you, I suppose, a practical example at this point. Noting that I'm freestyling here, but that's okay, isn't it? Okay, all right. Okay, so we have a assessment contact where we are going to a service. We have a referral. We have information from the Aged Care Complaints Commissioner that we're taking with us. It's about a complaint in relation to the care of an individual, and that information is in relation to pressure area care. And at the service, we identify that the pressure area care for care recipients broadly does not meet the requirements for expected outcome in relation to skin care, and a finding of failure is made in relation to that. Now, in coming to that view, we have sought to sample the folk who are living in that home currently, who have pressure care areas, and we've sought to understand the pressure area care for each of those individuals. So we've asked the question, how many people here are having pressure area care? And then we've gone to look at their particular files. We've talked to staff and management about them. We've noted whether there are photos that reflect how pressure area care is managed. And we have with us a referral, and that referral tells us something about two particular individuals that are, one's deceased and the other is now transferred to a hospital. And we seek to speak with the family members of those two particular individuals, and also we review their files. Their files are still at the home. That information in total informs us that that particular expected outcome does not meet the standards. So that's the first test here. Now, in coming to that decision, we apply procedural fairness. We say to the home, here is our report, what say you? So the home gets the opportunity to respond to that report and come back with information. Particularly, we're seeking to understand whether the information we gathered while we were there at the home is accurate and is complete, and there's not any misunderstanding that we have come to in documenting that particular piece. So we have that in front of us, and we make a decision. Now, following that decision of failure, we then seek to put the information back to the provider, approved provider or delegate, to say that based on that failure, we have identified particular individuals that we consider have been or may be placed at serious risk, and there's the opportunity once again to respond. Now, sometimes this stuff gets collapsed into a 2 or 3 day period, because if it is a significant risk in relation to very poor pressure area care, we don't want to extend out the time that we take to come to these decisions. But that is the process. So at that point, there a decision would be made that identified individuals have been placed or may be placed at serious risk. Now, once that decision is made, that information is provided to the Secretary of the Department of Health. That is also required under the Quality Agency Principles. The other factor here is that if we have significantly heightened concerns about the current care in relation to some of the individuals that we have sampled, we may choose to provide the information to the department as what is called an early release. So it goes to the department during the process, because it may be that that information is of such a significance the department would want to consider it for the purposes of making a decision about whether there is immediate and severe risk, and then potentially issuing sanctions. So this pathway is a pathway now that we have significantly greater clarity on, and we chose to use this seminar forum across Australia to start to engage with providers to assist their understanding of it. Have any of you had a serious risk decision made in relation to your service in recent times? No? Okay. All right. So I'm talking to a group of people that are looking at me with fear and trepidation, and are wondering what is this that they are now needing to understand and face. So what I said was that you would be advised that that as a result of the report and the additional information or response you provided, that we have identified a failure. Okay, so you have procedural fairness at the point where you, as you would in any assessment, you have the opportunity to respond prior to a decision. However, that is the failure decision, which would requires, once that decision is made, it requires the CEO to then consider whether the failure has placed or may place the person at serious risk. So in practical terms, what happens is the material that we put in the report to you may be challenged, or there may be other stuff that you can say, which then would suggest that maybe some of the individuals that were identified may or may not be in the mix for understanding whether they have been placed or may be placed at serious risk. So you may find that what comes back to you is a subset of those people. So we consider what you say. I mean, you may have a very compelling piece to persuade us differently about the care of a particular individual. So it could be that some of the information that you have now wasn't necessarily available on the day, and we're seeking to understand that. So there is that procedural fairness piece there that for every decision. However, once we've looked at that, we have to then decide now that we've looked at our report and your response, who are the individuals in the mix that have potentially have been placed or may be placed at serious risk, and that then is provided to you to consider. The not met is the failure. So if the decision, if you receive a decision saying that you do not meet expected outcome 2.7 medication management, that is the failure. That outcome is not met, and on the basis of that, the CEO must contemporaneously consider whether that failure to meet expected outcome 2.7 has placed or may place care recipients at serious risk. And the care recipients we are seeking to understand are those for which we've collected information on in our sampling process throughout that particular visit. They're the identified individuals. We are making more serious risk decisions because of the clarity around the CEO must consider. That is the case, yeah. But it's also the case that any failure of any expected outcome, potentially, if it's relevant to the care of care recipients, could lead to a serious risk decision. Now, it's much more likely to occur in the standard 2 outcomes or in standard 3 outcomes where we're talking about something that impacts on an individual than it is in a perhaps standard 1 or standard 4, but it's not impossible that it would happen there. But I'll show you a couple of slides in a minute and you'll see what the pattern of the stats look like, and you'll see the particular outcomes that are the ones that are consistently coming up for us in serious risk decisions. The failure is the first test. So we need to come to a view about whether the outcome is met or not met. So that's the threshold for making a serious risk decision. It has to be a current failure. So it's the failure today, but it could be in relation to the care of one person. That's definitely the case. But because the threshold is the failure, that we need to understand whether skin care is met or not met in order to determine whether that failure has placed or may place one person at serious risk. So I'm not trying to, I know that that's giving you any sort of comfort or a better understanding, but the test first is the failure test. Is the outcome met or not met? The picture I put out for you about the person with the pressure care area that's no longer in the home because they've been transferred to hospital, the test in terms of serious risk is about what care was provided to that person while they were at the home. So it's not the fact that they went to hospital. Going to hospital actually may have been the most positive part of that person's care journey, and going to hospital may well have been the most appropriate action taken at the time. The problem could be that actually that decision should have been made way back, and that the person was not receiving appropriate care to a point where there was no other option other than a hospitalisation at a stage that was probably too late to deal with that problem. So these are the questions that people are, I suppose, are grappling with, coming to terms with what the implications of this clarity provide for us. And that is there a relationship between serious risk and a failure to meet an expected outcome? And the answer is absolutely yes, because the failure is the trigger point for the CEO to consider whether there is serious risk. So if anything, any light bulbs come on in this process, I suppose that the importance here is to understand the significance of a failure of an expected outcome, where it's relevant to care. So where there's a finding that an approved provider has failed to meet one or more of the expected outcomes, as I said, the quality agency, CEO, must consider whether that failure has placed or may place the wellbeing of a care recipient at serious risk. Now, to date, we've only made one serious risk decision in relation to a home care service. And this particular set of circumstances it was in a remote community where the surveillance that was being provided by the service in relation to deteriorating clinical presentation was not appropriate or adequate to manage this person's deteriorating clinical status. Okay, does a finding of serious risk need to relate to an individual care recipient? Absolutely. Care recipient or care recipients. So it's identified individuals. So when you see the report, you will see in the evidence identified names, diagnoses, characteristics, dependencies around their care, examples of care deficiencies or issues, and that will be spelt out per person to give you line of sight. This is an open and transparent process. You need to know exactly what we're thinking and where we have identified the problems. And sometimes it will have, there'll be particular dates around care. You know, it could be a medication not administered, or it could be a medication administered inappropriately or unsafely on particular dates, or observations not made consistent with doctor's orders, etc. So it will have that information there, and your response should address anything there to make sure that we have a factually accurate piece, so that we can proceed to the next decision point. Any questions about the issue about people that have been transferred to hospital or another facility or home or living or deceased? Sorry, I'll say that again. Or live in the community, either living or deceased. Yeah. Any questions about that aspect? So you know that we, when we undertake an assessment, we seek to understand this care and circumstances of people who are at the home, but we may well have material with us that has been part of a referral from the Complaints Commissioner that may refer to someone who is no longer there. Either they've died or they've moved away somewhere else to another home or back to their family. Now that information is relevant. It is a relevant consideration in both the finding of failure and therefore the serious risk decision. So that information comes into play. So you may find a serious risk decision about a identified individual that is no longer at the home, because the section 2.63, I'll go back to it, refers to has placed or may place. So has placed supports a decision that is about the past. So is serious risk just really poor compliance? It has a significance as a decision beyond poor compliance because it's about the circumstances of a particular individual. So it's not just that we're not meeting medication management and then we're absolutely, doing it terribly, therefore we must have serious risk. Not meeting that expected outcome may well place a particular individual at more risk than someone else. So there is a way of understanding the impact of that failure on each person that we sample. And not everyone that we sample may have the same impact by the failure. The failure may impact one person more significantly because of their dependence. It may not impact others as significantly. So can a finding of serious risk be revised or resolved? And this is probably, for those of you who are more familiar with our material under the accreditation agency may have some sort of memory of us talking about mitigating risk or revising or resolving risk. Now, really the issue is that you guys do the resolving of the risk and the mitigating of the risk. We don't. There is no decision under the principles that revises or mitigates risk. So once a decision is made that there is serious risk, it's a point-in-time decision. We don't say at a later point, well, you don't have it anymore. So May Place. So if we make a decision about May Place, then in order to make that decision, we would have to determine that the circumstances may place the person at risk. So I suppose if we can't foresee it, then we can't make the decision. So we could be talking about a situation, you might be suggesting that we're foreseeing something that you're not foreseeing. In that story, I don't see necessarily how you haven't introduced anything to me there where I would say the service has placed the person at risk. So, I mean, 94% of people in residential aged care leave residential aged care through death. Only a very small percentage are rehabilitated or move on to other living arrangements. So we expect that people are in residential aged care up until what we hope is a good death. So care needs to be provided appropriately and well up until and including through death. But of course, lots of different things will happen in that space, and lots of things do happen in that space. They don't all, deterioration in your status is part of that journey to death. So we're not making a judgment that in and of itself presents serious risk. But if we take your example of the person who's had the stroke and they've had a fall, and the issues around that fall and the management of that fall, like if it was unseen, was there a potential head injury there? What is your process for managing that? What was your practice for managing it in this instance? How was that person supported post-fall? What sort of neural obs were taken? What sorts of medical attention was provided? How did you manage that piece? That's about your day-to-day management of care of an individual who may still, as a result of that fall, die. That's not your scenario doesn't present serious risk. The things I've added to the story around what happened, what did you do in response to that, are the questions that we would seek to understand whether there was serious risk. If you have a person that you are aware of through their admission information or their assessments that they are depressed, that they have they're expressing suicidal ideation or suicidal behaviour, then as you're responsible for looking after all their care, including their existential needs, you need to provide an environment to support them as well as you can in the context of where they live. Now, that would mean that if there were particular things that presented risks for that individual, like an unlocked balcony on a third floor, then you would need to ensure that that person didn't access those areas that provided them with that access to risk. So that's the expectation. Now, you may not be able to prevent somebody who's actively seeking to end their life, but if there are aspects of the way in which care is delivered that do not address their mental health needs or their emotional needs or their other supports, then potentially that person could come into the sample and understood as having been placed at serious risk. But it would be only in relation to the things that would be expected to be provided for that person that weren't provided. It's not about you needing to actively prevent the suicide, but it's about you actively providing the best care you can to a person who has those challenges and difficulties. So when we're looking at the notes or talking to staff, we would be asking questions. So noting that this person had suicidal ideation, what did you do in response to that? Or how did you develop a care plan or manage the support for this person, knowing that this was a potential risk for this person? Look, I just want to clarify that the serious risk decision is the decision of the quality agency. The Department of Health may or may not issue sanctions. So we've had instances of serious risk decisions where the department has not issued sanctions. So it's not necessarily the next step that sanctions will be issued by the department, but it is open to them, once they've received that report and that decision, to turn their minds, and they're required to under the Act, to turn their minds to the issue about whether that risk is immediate and severe. So that's their piece. What we will do following a decision of serious risk, remember we've already identified a failure, so it's likely, unless accreditation is revoked, and that's in very limited circumstances, we will place you on a timetable for improvement. You would expect that because you've got a failure. So timetable for improvement, usually 3 months, and we'll visit you during that period, probably in the middle of the TFI and definitely at the end of the TFI. And it may be, if there's significant failure, you will be required to undertake a further reaccreditation audit. If your accreditation's been varied back to 6 months or 8 months, then you'll find yourselves needing to reapply and then undertake a full reaccreditation at the end of the TFI. So those sorts of things happen, and they are all touch points where we are coming out and monitoring performance against the standards. We're coming out and assessing, and we are making findings. So that process continues in that way. However, there is not a point where we would come out and, as a result of an assessment, say this home no longer has serious risk, because there is no decision in the statute to support that. There's no serious risk decision. So that's the clarity that we have now. There is no, and I understand providers would seek that from us. They would say, well, come out and tell us that we don't have serious risk anymore. Well, that's not serious. Serious risk is not a state of being. It's just a decision point on a given day. You're not under serious risk. It's a decision point. So because you're not under it, you can't get out of it. You've just had a decision made in relation to identified care recipients that have been placed or may be placed. Now, in the event that the decision was people may be placed at serious risk, then clearly they're the individuals that you would be seeking to focus your efforts to improve the care or the circumstances of those folk. So when we do come out consequent to that decision, they're the people that we'll be following up, because we want to know what is occurring for those people that were identified in a serious risk report. But not for the purposes of saying they're no longer at serious risk, but just to see what are you doing, because those are the folk that are the sample that we use to find the failure. The timetable for improvement is imposed where there is a finding of failure, but the finding of failure, the expected outcome, may not be relevant to the particular care of individuals. So that's an example of where it's a relevant failure to an individual, but not not in relation to serious risk. I was thinking more of examples where this failure for which there was wasn't particularly relevant to care. You will see this through the lens of a report, because the report identifies the sample, and the sample that will have specific information about identified care recipients. So you will see it there. So if we're talking in more general terms in a report about problems with occupational health and safety or the living environment, where we haven't identified how that impacts on particular individuals, it's not likely that we're seeking to understand that there is serious risk there. But by the way, this conversation will be clear to you during the visit, because we'll be asking questions about particular individuals to seek to understand their care and circumstances. So we've got a landing on that about we don't revise the decision and we don't resolve the decision. The department may or may not choose to make a decision that there is immediate and severe risk and issue sanctions. It's not contingent. It's possible, but it doesn't. It's not for every serious risk decision. And while I don't want to talk on behalf of the department, since I'm the quality agency, I can just suggest to you that the context for understanding their decision is whether it's immediate and severe. So it's about stuff that is present at the home now that is going to inform their immediate and severe decision. So do we publish the decision? The answer is yes. So on our website, when you go and look at our website, you will see against each home the last 3 published reports. Now in the case of a review audit or a reaccreditation audit, if there is a serious risk decision attached to that particular activity, you will see that decision, the decision of serious risk, on the website against that activity. It's on our website. At this point, it's not on My Aged Care website, but we're hoping that consumers will do a bit of shopping using our website as well, because we now have the consumer experience report, which is published alongside the reaccreditation report. So we're monitoring our website to see how many hits it's getting around that particular report. So there's a couple of slides here, and I'll just start with this one. So this is just looking at New South Wales and ACT, and you can see, if you follow it across, you'll see the dates on which the activity occurred. You'll also see the activity. In most cases, they were review audits. There was one reaccreditation audit there though. And the expected outcomes that were found to have failed or not met its decision, it's over here as well. You can see. Okay, so you can see that there was significant failure found in some of those review audits. But the serious risk relates to a smaller a subset of those outcomes. So leisure interests and activities is up there, but I want to point out one of them, 3.6, and I'm not citing this particular review audit, by the way. I'm just drawing this from here, and that is an instance where a care recipient had complained to the home on a number of occasions that they were not being toileted in a timely way, and they were defecating into their pad, and it made them feel really depressed and miserable and distressed. And we were able to follow this through and find examples of where there actually had been complaints. So it was actually in their complaint system, but the person was able to tell the team about their feelings and their experience of feeling so distraught that was their circumstances. So that led to a failure in 3.6, privacy and dignity. And privacy and dignity, because it wasn't just about continence management, it wasn't just about the physical aspect of getting the person out of their bed and onto a toilet. It was about the feelings that they felt and how distressed they were around their own dignity of being placed in that situation. So I'll just move on to a couple of other places. So there's some more examples there. Now you can see that where these are review audits, these would be reports that are published on our website. So this is published report stuff. But in that top one, the example was with a significant failure across multiple expected outcomes, but it was skincare. Now, the linked outcomes in that top one, in the NT, you might see 1.6 there. So, and I know from this particular matter, the nexus between staffing and having people that are being positioned appropriately or receiving appropriate pressure care area, very much linked to staffing in this particular instance. So you can see the top 3 are exactly what you guys spotted this yourself, so you're already on the same wavelength here. But that staffing issue against clinical care and against challenging behaviour or behavioural management is a profile that we see in these failures to meet standards and serious risk decisions for identified individuals. I understand the dilemma, and a number of those parts of the story that you talked about are part of the picture that we see. But with our decisions, we are seeking to understand what you have done in response. And in most cases, in all cases pretty much where these decisions are made, it hasn't been a case that where the home is saying we've exhausted all our available resources and we can't solve this problem. It's often the case that referrals have not been made and they haven't been attempted. It wasn't that they tried to refer and then the service said, sorry, we can't get out to you. It was that referrals weren't made in a timely way. And as you pointed out, it's not just the individual who has aggressive or inappropriate behaviour. It's all the other people downstream, including staff, that are impacted by this. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that this isn't a very complex and difficult issue to manage, but the instances where we make decisions of failure and serious risk often will include fairly obvious deficits or problems or lack of response, and sometimes it's even more problematic than that, and that is that staff target the person or ignore the person. Often people that are being hit are saying, or their families are saying, you know, my person's being hit or interfered with by this person. So the home is aware of these matters, and there is no evidence to show that they are actively dealing with it. Now, active dealing with a problem is relevant information that we would want in a response. So we want to know when referrals were made, what meetings or case meetings were held to try and deal with it, how you may be reorganising the people that are delivering the care to try and match staff best with that particular person, whether you're moving people around to reduce the vulnerability of some people that can't defend themselves. All those things are part of a plan that has some strategy to it to try and resolve or decrease the likelihood that there would be risk. They're all relevant, but that's what we would want to see and need to see, active engagement by the home to both protect vulnerable people and the person who is allegedly perpetrating. And by the way, we have to look at that person who is the alleged perpetrator, where they have a cognitive impairment and they're not able to control their own behaviour. I mean, that experience for them of being aggressive and being inappropriate, which alienates them from every relationship with everybody else in the place, staff, family and other care recipients, is sometimes the reason for the serious risk. That person, through their own circumstances, is at risk because, you know, they are in a very miserable state and through their own challenges in governing their own behaviour. But this and you know, when we started with that story about the person that had the stroke, and your story is another example. It's not the characteristics of the individual that leads to serious risk. It's the lack of the appropriate management and response and dealing with the difficulty that is likely to be relevant in the decision. Okay, so that's just a wrap up of where the process goes. So we make the decision and we provide the report to the Department of Health. So the assessment team is gathering the evidence. The state director or delegate assesses that information in relation to potential non-compliance immediately, provides sufficient and relevant information to the state director about the failure, so that's from the team. The team provides specific and relevant information about how care recipients have been affected by the failure. Once again, that's the assessment team. And the team report is a critical piece because it assists us to understand whether there is failure and whether that failure has placed or may place individuals at serious risk. And as we said, the Department of Health has a responsibility of understanding whether that serious risk decision and the circumstances at that home warrant a decision of immediate and severe, and whether sanctions would be imposed. And that happens sometimes, but not necessarily always following a decision of serious risk. And if we direct them to go back and ask them further questions, or go back into another day, or we ring you, it's because we as a delegate need to understand the evidence. So we might need more information from you over the phone, or we might need a written response from you. You certainly have the opportunity to provide more information to us, but we will seek to understand the care and circumstances of those identified individuals critically, because that informs that decision. Decision maker gets the assessment team's report and decides if there's a failure. Step 2, consider whether there needs to be an earlier release of information to the department. I mentioned that right at the beginning. Sometimes we provide an early release of information to the department if we're concerned about the information we've gathered. Step 3, we notify the AP in writing, listing specific evidence of potential serious risk, including reasons, and we give the approved provider a short period to respond to that evidence. A decision is made about whether there is non-compliance, and a decision is made about serious risk. The department is informed immediately if there's serious risk to make a decision on whether to increase compliance monitoring through assessment contacts. Any questions there? Okay. All right, so based on the I'm being wrapped up thing, last slide I'll go to, which just says that the notification of serious risk is on our website in the same place as the report of the activity. So where it's a review audit report and decision, that if there was serious risk decision made at that point, that's where the information will be published. So here's an example in relation to Mrs. Smith. So this is how it gets written up in the report. I've made the decision that the home has placed Mrs. Smith at serious risk because of its failure to appropriately manage her skin and wound care. The home failed to provide wound care consistent with assessed medical need, which led to the wound significantly deteriorating within a 1-month period. This ultimately resulted in Mrs. Smith requiring hospital admission and surgical intervention on her sacral wound in order to manage her health, safety and well-being. So the risk was that because the care was inappropriate, insufficient at a point in time, this required hospitalisation and a surgical intervention. Now, given that Mrs. Smith's probably, aged 90 with other comorbidities, the risk for her to have to undergo an anaesthetic for the purposes of having a wound being debrided or other surgical intervention is a risk that is associated with the care in the lead up to that admission. It's about how that wound was managed pre-hospital admission that we are focusing on here. So each decision's a separate statutory decision made at a point in time about an identified individual, and that's why it said Mrs. Smith. It wasn't about everyone's wounds, it was that particular wound, that particular care circumstance. There is no mitigation or removal, and decisions are published on our website. And that just tells you the key points, that you're provided with a report and an opportunity to provide a response. Depending on the nature of that information, it could be several hours up to a couple of days, not much longer than that. The CEO delegate considers the assessment team's report and your response to determine if failures have placed or may place a care recipient at serious risk. And a decision is made by a delegate of the CEO. Resources that you can look at, and we're welcome you to make contact with us if you have questions after the session today, if you want further clarification. But there's information on our website under AACQA Regulatory Bulletin. You also have information in the Surveyor Handbook if you want to go there It's on our website as well. You can download it, and it's on page 71 and 72. And there's a serious risk fact sheet as well.